Library Ruin is gonna be out next week, so before Cess finally makes a video and floods the Steam reviews with, hey people, I might as well get this one out. For those of you who just stumbled upon this video and don't know what I'm talking about, Lobotomy Corporation is a Korean indie-based management slash horror game. It draws inspiration from Cabin in the Woods, Warehouse 13, and of course the SCP Foundation wiki. And in my opinion, it's the closest thing we have right now to a proper SCP video game. Sure, there are other more popular SCP inspired games out there like SCP Containment Breach, but they tend to focus only on experiencing the weirdness firsthand. In comparison, Lobotomy Corporation instead went for recreating SCP's main themes, namely exploring how to methodically study and contain the supernatural, as well as the overall sense of dread and hopelessness of the endeavor. It also takes place in its own universe, so it retains a sense of mystery that is lost from basing it on existing works. These two traits put Lobotomy Corporation above other games in capturing the essence of the SCP Foundation. Basically, it's the difference between seeing SCP-173 in action and reliving the experience of reading the SCP-173 file for the first time. The game's focus on slow unraveling of mystery leads us to the first piece of advice in this guide. The best way to experience Lobotomy Corporation is to go in blind. This one's a no-brainer, especially for those who found this video by searching for a spoiler-free guide to Lobotomy Corporation. And to be honest, it's not that hard to avoid spoilers since this game isn't as popular as, say, Undertale. There are still ways to accidentally spoil yourself though. A good example would be Steam's community content section. Ideally, spoiler tags should prevent you from seeing spoilers, but even the non-tagged pictures can still spoil you. I'd recommend reducing Steam's window height to hide the community content, or you can open the game without viewing the game page. Sites like the fandom wiki or the subreddit also have the same problem. It's safe to say that if you look for info about the game, you will be spoiled. Even the in-game footage in this video can be a bit spoilery, so I'll limit the footage to the tutorial and the first few days. That said, the Steam store page is safe. The trailer doesn't give away much and the description is fairly spoiler-free. As with the library page, don't scroll down to the reviews section. Let's Plays can also be spoiler-free. In fact, I got interested in the game after stumbling upon the first episode of Sinvicta's third run. I liked what I saw, so I stopped at the middle of the second episode to prevent myself from being spoiled any further. At this point, you might be wondering, if going in blind is so important to preserve the mystery of the game, why should I continue watching? Well, to put it bluntly, you need a guide because the game is hard. Really hard. The other tips I'll give won't necessarily make the game any easier, but they can shave off some hours from the most frustrating parts of the game. On the other hand, if you're fully on board with the frustration and the despair that comes with SCPs, go ahead and close this video. Before we proceed, note that the rest of the video will assume you've already gone through the tutorial and scrolled through the manual. So admittedly, the info there may be too much to handle right now. I also suggest playing through the first few days. You can pause the video and come back once you're done. While Lobotomy Corporation just oozes with style and charm, there's no denying that it's still an indie game with indie game flaws. Since this jank will be the biggest hurdle for new players getting into the game, we'll have to address them first. At the top of the jank list is the controls. Despite being a Korean game, it's no StarCraft or League. It just doesn't have the same amount of features like hotkeys or control groups. You can't really do much about the controls, but there are some things you can do to make things a little bit more tolerable. First off, agents always return to the room where they came from after performing an action. This means you can station agents near abnormalities that are far from their departments, so they don't need to walk all the way back every time they work. you can just call them back once they go low on HP or SP. Similarly, if you expect an agent to fail and cause an abnormality to escape, you can station a group of employees armed with appropriate ego equipment in the room in front of the said abnormality. Speaking of suppression, proper room positioning can mean the difference between a flawless suppression and a full wipe. The basic tactic would be to split your team with the tougher melee tanks at the room closest to the enemy and your weaker ranged agents at the next room. Then once the suppression starts, you can easily select and order the two groups separately. One thing that you'll notice once you start grouping agents into rooms is that wide rooms tend to spread agents out. To prevent this, you can use elevators and force them to stay in one spot. This has its pros and cons. On one hand, clumped agents are easier to control as a group. And once you get bullets later on in the game, their small area of effect affects multiple employees if they are close together. On the other hand, many enemies also have a small area of effect, so you don't want to clump together one-shottable newbies with hardened veterans. On the topic of elevators, note that they essentially teleport your employees to the next floor after a short delay. This tip may or may not be helpful later in your game. The next tip should be in the tutorial but somehow isn't. If you misclick and send the wrong agent or choose the wrong type of work, you can just click the containment unit again to cancel the action. It's better to spend a few seconds to redo the work and make sure it's correct, rather than retry the whole day just because you misclicked. And to wrap up the control tips, learn to use the speed controls, especially the pause button. Your agent's survival depends on you being able to micro them while paused. Next on the jank list is the technobabble. You know, the ones you see in the loading screens. They may raise some red flags, and you may be worried that this is yet another indie game where everything's just a confusing mess with unexplained stuff smashed together to make things look cool or atmospheric. Unfortunately, I can't really address the technobabble without spoiling anything. All I can say is that things will make more sense as you play the game. And in the end, the game strikes a good balance between explaining the lore and leaving things up for speculation. The recent patch also clears up a lot of things that were lost in translation. And last on the jank list, jump scares. This is an indie horror game, so will there be jump scares? Simple answer is yes. Technically, a couple of abnormalities will kind of jump at you in certain conditions. But as you will eventually find out, there are many more far scarier things in this game, and they don't have to rely on cheap tricks. With the jank out of the way, let's move on to the other tips. A lot of players miss this, but Lobotomy Corporation is the roguelike. In the course of the game, you may find yourself picking an abnormality that's too difficult to handle, and the game doesn't explicitly tell you what to do when that happens. What it actually expects you to do is to return to memory repository and pick a different abnormality. However, unless you've read and understood the manual, you might not even know what that does and think it just rolls back everything to the last checkpoint. What it really does is, in addition to returning you to the imprint day, you'll retain all your research and all your crafted ego equipment. Missions are also retained, though note that missions are only technically completed at the end of your day. In short, it lets you retry picking abnormalities at the price of losing your agent's leveling progress and their ego gifts. But what if you hit an abnormality wall on the memory imprint day? This is where the first day menu option comes in. It's the same as return to memory repository, but it goes all the way back to the start of the game. And well, it almost feels like cheating. Retaining all of your ego equipment means all of your employees will be overpowered at the start of the game, letting you breeze through days or even weeks. Retaining all research progress means you can choose to skip abnormalities you've already completed. or choose to get them again for grinding stats. All at the low price of losing all of your employees. This roguelike mechanic teaches you one important lesson. Remember that even though you'll spend hours, days, weeks, or even longer with your employees, they are ultimately expendable. Try not to get too attached to them. Unless of course you're willing to spend lob points and customize all of your employees to match those from previous cycles. A quick note before we move on. If one of your agents accidentally dies and you go, "Screw this, let's pick another abnormality," do not use return to memory repository immediately. This will take a snapshot of your current ego state, so while you will save your employee, their equipment will be lost as it was lost the moment you rolled back to the memory imprint. The correct approach would be to use retry first to save the ego equipment, then return to memory repository. The previous tip was a bit misleading. Because when you think typical indie roguelikes, you expect a run to take about half an hour. Maybe 2 to 3 hours tops. Lobotomy Corporation runs, well, they take far longer than that. So while you could cheese the game by restarting over and over, it may be far more rewarding to learn how to deal with the difficult challenges through careful planning, determination, a bit of luck, and a lot of retries. This approach may sound familiar, trying again and again, being screwed by careless mistakes or just plain RNG, but eventually succeeding. Lobotomy Corporation is the Dark Souls of indie horror games. Sarcasm aside, the two main strategies for playing the game are indeed the roguelike approach of carefully picking abnormalities, and the so-called Souls-like approach of getting good. You can prefer one route, or you can try to balance both. And in the end, it's ultimately up to what works for you. Regardless of which playstyle you choose, most of your playtime will be grinding your employee stats. Better stats means your employees can work with more dangerous abnormalities and survive longer in combat. In other words, the less you'll need to retry and restart. Temperance is a prime target for grinding as it improves success rate and work speed. Not to mention, one sin being the first abnormality gives everyone a chance to grind the stat at any time. However, you must have a good spread of abnormalities among all stats. Just having 1 or 2 grindable stats will leave your agents unprepared for more difficult challenges later in the game. Apart from stat diversity, you'd also want a good mix of low and high risk abnormalities. It's not mentioned in the manual, but successfully working on higher tiered abnormalities gives more stat bonuses at the end of the day. So having more VAVs and LFs means you can level your agents faster, in addition to getting more energy per work, which in turn will allow you to finish days with minimal Cliffos meltdowns. On the other hand, if you don't have enough low-risk abnormalities, you'll have trouble leveling up your new hires, forcing you to either go through more meltdowns just to squeeze in more grinding work each day, or spend lob points on them. And to wrap up the grinding tips, you may find that the hidden end-of-day rewards turn grinding into more of a chore than a challenge. Fortunately, there's a mod that can reveal them. It also exposes the actual base stats, which would also clue you in on the hidden title bonuses. However, it also shows the exact success rates, so you should probably avoid it if you want to retain as much of the original experience as possible. As a compromise, I'd recommend adding it late in the game as a personal reward for completing the harder missions. The next tip is still related to grinding, but it's broad enough that it deserves its own section. As the difficulty ramps up and you find yourself hitting retry more often, you might want to start writing things down. A good example would be the agent info, as the game lacks the in-game unit tables that you find in other games. Having a separate document or spreadsheet on another window means you no longer have to scroll through your departments when looking for agents with specific traits. Here's what you can put in your agent notes: their department, level, stats, though if it gets too tedious you can just use their stat levels, stats they need to grind, and here you can just highlight or color the stats to save space, and their role or other miscellaneous comments. As for combat and equipment data, I'd suggest moving them to a separate table, one where you can arrange your agents into specialized teams. This way, rather than always ordering an all-out attack and have the newbies die constantly, instead you can have an elite squad of top agents ready to take down the more dangerous threats. You can then have other teams that support that squad, say 1 or 2 weaker teams on standby in case another abnormality breaches at the same time, or another team armed with white weapons for treating panicking agents, and so on. Next up would be your abnormality notes. There you can log their stat requirements and important notes like the conditions which will lead to an instant breach or an instant death. You can also assign agents here, like dedicated guards for cliff house meltdowns and priority training lists. Speaking of abnormalities, the codex isn't available when picking them, so having a simplified personal codex can help you decide which to pick or skip in future runs. Names and some personal comments are usually enough. And lastly, if you're having trouble completing a challenge, you can combine all of the above and plan out what to do throughout the day. Assign agents for each meltdown level, determine who's going to suppress ordeals, make sure you have enough agents to deal with the worst case meltdown RNG, and so on. Even with all of the tips above, you might still hit a wall where you can't progress unless you look up spoilers. In my case, all it took to end my first blind run was a single, unassuming high-class abnormality. My standard containment procedures back then didn't work on it. I tried every combination of employee level and work type, but they all failed to squeeze out even a single PE box. The only hint was in the flavor text, but at that point in my run, I've already dismissed them as mere fluff. Or worse, they're red herrings tricking me to performing the wrong type of work. I could return to memory repository to skip it, but I was also fully into a hardcore no-repick playstyle. In the end, I decided to turn my blind run into a partially blind one and look up the abnormality. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's okay to give in and look up things in order to make some progress. Sure, you may encounter some other spoilers, but hopefully you held out long enough that most of them are no longer spoilers as you've already seen them in the game. Also, this game's obscure enough that stumbling upon spoilers for the final stretch of the game is highly unlikely. Unless of course you actively go to places that have them, for example, reviews. And that's all I have to say. Go and figure out the rest on your own.